Well, some might say that the worst thing they can imagine would be to be wrongly accused and sentenced to a lifetime in prison. Eric Voles, a man who was wrongly accused, tried and found guilty of the murder of his ex-girlfriend and sentenced to 30 years in prison for a crime he did not commit, experienced and survived that very nightmare. Joining us in studio, Eric will share with us his memoir, Gringo Nightmare, a young American framed for murder in Nicaragua, and the story of how his faith, family, and grassroots efforts around the world eventually helped to overturn his conviction and end his captivity in Nicaragua. Welcome to the Busted Halo Show, Eric Voles.
It's great to be here.
Thank you. This is one of these stories which, as people are kind of reading it or even hearing about it, or so, you know, you were on Anderson Cooper a couple years ago when you first got back, and I think that's when some notoriety came to your case. I think it kind of makes people a little scared. Scared about, you know, justice around the world or traveling or that sort of thing. Has it changed your view of like other countries, how we might feel safe or not?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is, a cautionary tale in many ways. I was a young, surfer from California. Yeah. Had, Hispanic roots and took off to Central America to chase a dream and
sure.
Do some good along the way. But I think that there are cases like this that are happening more and more frequently where we see American citizens that get caught up in these kind of, political show trials.
Tell us a little bit about your story. You said you were going to Nicaragua to do some good. You started up a magazine. You published a magazine, right? A bilingual magazine?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, it was a bilingual publication that was really, it was an entertainment magazine, but really focused on kind of cultural tourism topics, and ultimately just trying to bridge kind of a cultural gap between the local residents and kind of this oncoming wave of foreigners that were resettling, retiring, and traveling in the Caribbean and in Central America.
And primarily, I mean, bilingual, assuming English and Spanish, primarily a lot of visitors, travelers, or settlers from America or from the West?
Yeah, I mean, just, most developed countries, Europe, Australia, definitely, the richer countries.
So for the first couple of years you were there, kind of liked it.
It was amazing. we were really having an impact. We were young. We were, making a living doing what we loved, and we felt like it was, and we were doing good. So I think it was perfect. It was perfect.
Now something went wrong, though.
I got a phone call that changed my life.
As a matter of fact, I noticed that the phone call came to you. Was that the November 21st? Was that the day she died, or was that the day you kind of?
No, that's correct. Yeah,
because that was the day my father died. That's why.
Oh, wow.
I noticed that date.
Oh, wow.
That was you. Probably that date stands out in your mind now as well. You got a call that your former girlfriend, you'd been together in Nicaragua, had broken up amicably a year or so before, and you got a call that she had been murdered.
I was in the magazine office with 10 people. And received a phone call from one of her close friends informing me that she had been found raped and murdered in her store.
Oh, my. Wow. Well, before we get to the fact that you later ended up in prison, I'd imagine that alone would be pretty difficult.
Yeah, I mean, how do you, put your arms around that?
Sure.
Here's a dear friend who's gone. I think, especially for Americans, kind of oppression and terror and injustice is usually kept pretty far from our doorstep. So, I'd never had a friend, even tragically die, much less, have their life taken.
Right. And it was clear right away that she was murdered.
Well, it wasn't.
Yeah, okay.
There was a lot of rumors, but just for the sake of clarification, it was a murder.
Right. Okay. And so the long story short, at least that part of it, is that you were convicted of her murder. A murder that you did not commit.
Right. I jumped in my car with another friend of hers who also worked with me at the magazine. We immediately drove the 2-hour journey to the town where the crime happened. We picked up her father along the way.
Wow.
We were there to, support her family and friends and do what you do when something tragic happens. And 2 days later, and just moments after the funeral, I was roughed up by the police, thrown in the back of a truck, and they slowly drove me through the middle of the town.
Wow.
Kind of as if to, feel this emotional kind of necessity that the town had to have a culprit.
Wow. And I presume that for these days, you were mostly in a space of mourning and not thinking to yourself, well, gee, I, better get a lawyer. Maybe I better get out of the country because they might frame me or throw me in jail or something like that. This had not occurred to you.
Well, and that was one, I think, now looking back and especially learning about the trauma of the experience, that was one of the most, unnatural aspects of this story is that, it went from mourning the death of a friend all of a sudden to me having to completely marginalize that pain.
Wow.
And, worry about my own survival in prison. What should have been the Doris Jimenez case very quickly became the Eric Voles case, even in the press. And she was kind of, in a lot of ways, forgotten.
Doris Jimenez was your ex-girlfriend.
Correct. Yeah. She's the victim.
Yeah. And I remember, in fact, I'm fairly sure it was the interview you did with Anderson Cooper where he asked you, and your story goes on, and the memoir is Gringo Nightmare, a young American framed for murder in Nicaragua, and how over a year that you spent in prison on a 30-year sentence, there would have been unmentionable negative aspects to that. And I remember he asked you what was the worst part of all this, and you said the loss of her and the fact that her memory has largely gone, unrecognized.
Well, again, there are a lot of cases with Americans who are, facing they're not able to get justice due to political tensions or some sort of cross-cultural misunderstanding. But in this case, it started with an act of violence against a woman that was never investigated. Really? Well, that's exactly what happened.
They didn't investigate the real. Exactly. They found you and they figured.
But what the headlines absorbed was this young American who's facing a nightmare situation, his family, his mother, the people who are trying to get him out. But Doris and the fact that essentially nobody had done anything to really hand justice to her was really never mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So I can't imagine that any time spent in a prison in Nicaragua would be good, but you spent a year there. Is it something that has scarred you permanently, changed you?
Well, yes. But I've come to understand, crisis as a gift in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. The good news about injustice is that God hates it. Yeah. And I think that, I know I can speak personally. There was a lot of people that really learned from this situation. It really helped put life in perspective for them. Sure. I received letters, I've had face-to-face conversations with people who, have just told me how it's been really inspiring to see, that again, good does prevail over evil.
What role did your faith in God or that of your family play in you surviving that ordeal?
When I went into to prison, I wasn't a Christian, actually. Oh, okay. I was raised in a Christian household. Interesting. But, life had been, pretty smooth. I'd never really been tested. And so I think, like anyone, I was prone to wander. And ultimately, it wasn't even necessarily that I felt God's love or, some scripture that really got my attention. What really rattled me was, for the first time, experiencing real evil. Mm. There's a saying in prison that, it's kind of the petri dish for evil. It's a devil's playground. And I found that to be very true. I'd never seen any, a demon-possessed person before until I went to prison. Wow. So, if that's real, there has to be a flip side. It wasn't until all the, things that we have and we really use to kind of create this sense of illusion of success. For me, it was my magazine, my job, my clothing, the music I listened to, internet. Once all of that was stripped away, and I was minimized, there was less of me, and then it left space for, God to come in and really speak to me. And that's what happened. We're talking with Eric Voles. He's the author of Gringo Nightmare, a young American framed for murder in Nicaragua, and an opportunity for faith to come. It really is the way we describe what we call the Paschal mystery in Christianity, and that is that from tragic events and many times death comes oftentimes life and life eternal. And for you, it was that tragic event of seeing evil up close that brought you into the arms of God. Yeah, and I have to mention too, it was really also the letters that I got from people that really was, spoke to me. I received letters from people from all over the world, all different walks of faith. Wow. And a lot of the kind of, ideas that I was, hearing, they might make sense if, you lost your job, or you have a flat tire, or you're in traffic. Right. Or, the wind, something happens. But when you're really facing the reality of death and asking yourself the big questions, the only thing that really, for me, unlocked the key was what the scriptures say. Wow.